up until recently, faith-based education was considered an uncontested feature of education within the UK. I think they were seen as identifiable of UK schooling as classrooms, textbooks, and long summer holidays. And I think the church historically has played a major role and quite a successful role, as it happens, in educating generations of British children. But I think over the last couple of years, humanist-based organisations, commentators, and I think a growing opinion in wider society, believes that selecting a child's school place on faith grounds is fundamentally wrong. They believe that it fosters and entrenches divisions in wider society, leading children to be isolated from others, and thus perhaps it goes against the spirit of an all-inclusive multicultural society. Many also believe that what is taught in faith-based schools is perhaps inappropriate and even wrong for the 21st century, and often they send dubious messages that perhaps need to be combated. Richard Dawkins goes so far as to say that a religious-based education is tantamount to a form of emotional child abuse because it involves an element of indoctrination. More recently, the controversies surrounding the Trojan horse debacle involving some 21 schools in Birmingham further raised questions as to whether ultra-conservative religious views have any place in the classroom today. Elsewhere, newly established free schools with the faith-based teachings have been exposed as inadequate regarding teaching and the values that were passed on in the classroom. But it also seems that faith schools can't win, in the sense that those schools that achieve excellent results are denounced as being elitist because they provide middle-class parents with access to top-performing schools via the back door. So denouncing faith schools, like the broader hostility towards traditional religious values, is seen by many to be quite a radical and forward-thinking idea, and thus I think there's a relish in taking on what they deem to be outdated beliefs and values. Many people argue that a secular society should have a secular education system free from any influence of particular religious beliefs and practices. But I think all this raises further questions as to whether such a standpoint is a portrayal of the true meaning of secularism, which is to enshrine the freedom and toleration of religious worship free from repressive clampdowns. And another question to think of is there a danger of restricting parental choice regarding how they want their children raised, and a demand that they conform to what new cultural elites believe are acceptable views. Okay, so these are some of the issues then that our panellists will be tackling this afternoon. I am now going to introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to speak first. To my far right over there we have Rabbi Jonathan Romain, who's rabbi in Birkenhead and is a chair for the ACORD Coalition for Inclusive Education. Next up, we'd have to my left here Michelle Tepper, who's an associate at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. Third speaker to my immediate right is Ricky Thompson, who's the campaigns officer. Richie Thompson, as a campaigns officer for the Faith Schools and Education from the British Humanist Association. And finally, to my far left, we'll have Kevin Rudy, a politics teacher and head of social science at Queen's School in Bushey, and a blogger at Fans for Freedom. Okay, so Jonathan, if you'd like to kick us off.
Now look, as a rabbi, I am in favour of faith, following my own and respecting that of others. So it may seem a little counterintuitive that I'm against faith schools, but I am, and what's more, on religious grounds. Bearing in mind that Judaism in particular and religion in general isn't just about dogmas and rituals, but it's also about values and ethics and morals, and that includes fairness. And you'd expect fairness, whether it's in personal dealings or in public life, to apply especially to schools and the educational system where we shape young minds. But unfortunately, it's actually a very different story in state-funded faith schools of a religious character, where it's often a story not of equality, but of division. And that unfairness starts right at the store gate in terms of who's allowed in, those with the right faith, and who is barred, those with the wrong faith or no faith, which speaks volumes, doesn't it, about how we bring up those children and the lesson we teach them about relating to each other. And the problem is that you and I are actually so used to it, we just don't realise how offensive and corrosive it is. I mean, why should schools be the only part of public sector that's legally allowed to discriminate in the case of religion? I mean, can you imagine, just think about it, the uproar if that was to apply anywhere else? No Muslims allowed in those swimming pools. No Jews in those libraries. It would be unthinkable, it would be laughable, and yet it happens not only in state-funded institutions, but in the very institutions where we like to think we're bringing up young minds for a better, fairer, more inclusive society. So what sort of message are we giving them right from the word go? Now, I know the historic role that churches played in providing education in the Middle Ages when no one else did, and all credit to them. But that is no longer a reason for discrimination today. And you know, if we were to start all over again, if we were to invent the educational system with a blank sheet of paper, is it remotely conceivable that we would maintain those rules and say that the wrong beliefs can get your child turned away from a school that's not only local, but also whose perspective says it values all children? And so the Accord Coalition, which I represent, which unites those from across the spectrum, religious and atheist, want to see inclusive education in principle and because it's actually better in practice, whether it's for the children who attend or for the sort of society that they're going to emerge. Conversely, we're very worried by schools that divide children, and that is the result of faith schools. For some, it's intentional. For others, it's the unintended consequence. But either way, you're creating ghettos. Jews over there, Catholics there, Sikhs there, Hindus there, Muslims there, COV, and so forth. And the converse, of course, is that by pulling together those children away, for instance, Christian children away from all the others, it means that the rest of society is denuded from whatever influence they might have had to bear. Now, you could be polite and call this parallel education, or you could be more direct and call it segregation. But whatever level or whatever name you give it, it's just simply not healthy. And it's no good for society to ghettoise its children so that they grow up physically apart and also mentally apart in a sort of us and them culture. And of course, it's not just the kids, is it? I mean, if you divide the children, you're also dividing the parents who no longer meet at the school gate or at school plays or sports days, and you're cutting huge swathes through society. And it sort of rather begs a question to the religious groups, doesn't it, my lot, whether faith has to go hand in hand with discrimination and why faith can't maintain itself without having those discriminatory rights. And by the way, it's not just me that says that, there's people within the church too. And you may remember that the Bishop of Oxford, who is the lead bishop on education within the Church of England, suggested that all Church of England schools should limit their intake to Christian children of a maximum of 10%. 10%. And it was sort of half endorsed by the current Archbishop Justin Welby, who said that church schools should move towards inclusive education. And again, this isn't a secular attack on education, but it comes from religious conviction. You know, the line that Jews, Christians, and others share of love your neighbour as yourself. But you can't love your neighbour unless you actually know your neighbour and know what makes him or her tick and what motivates them. And which is why I, as a rabbi, chose not to send my children to the local Jewish school, but to a community school, so that they could sit next to a Christian in class, play football in the break with a Muslim, do homework with a Hindu, and walk home with an atheist. And I think they were better educated as a result, and so were those other children. It's not healthy for children to be brought up like Rapunzel in an ivory tower, cut off from society around them. And of course, as the chairman mentioned, the Trojan horse debacle was a wake-up call for those who, until now, had rather benignly viewed the ability of faith schools to pass on their traditions, without realising that it also meant they could indoctrinate their children and alienate them from society. And of course, those Birmingham schools weren't even faith schools. That's the supreme irony. They weren't faith schools, but had they been faith schools, some of the things that they would have done would have been permitted legally. So how can it be that what we found offensive in community schools would have been permissible if we'd relabelled them as faith schools? And you know, the really astonishing thing is that we were warned of this 5 years ago, when, if you remember, we had the riots in Oldham and Burnley and Bradford, and the report by Professor Ted Cantell, who talked about the problems, one of which was separate faith schools. And if you go over the waters to Northern Ireland, what do you find there? An astonishing success story of the integrated schools. Now, we all know that the mistrust between Protestants and Catholics has got long and deep roots, but there's no doubt that they were underpinned by an educational system that kept the children separate and perpetuated stereotypes. So whereas in now the demand for places in integrated schools, which integrate both Catholics and Protestants, that has shot up despite the actual number of children in the province going down. Could that possibly have a message for us? Do those Northern Ireland parents, are they a bit more savvy about the how faith can divide children? So let's say yes to faith, but no to discrimination in faith schools, yes to values, and no to segregation.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Michelle, your thoughts, please.
Thanks so much. I largely agree with a lot of what the rabbi just spoke about. Coming from, obviously, if you can tell by my accent, not originally a British background. I grew up in America, and I have been in the UK for 13 years. I'm now a citizen, come back to the real country, you might say. I think that all schools should be looked at on grounds of what type of education they provide. My daughter just started reception, and she is going to a local faith-based school in my area, which I found out about from my neighbor who is a practicing Sikh. I would have never known that it was up the road. We had just moved from Oxford. I'd been in Oxford for 10 years after studying there. We just moved to kind of High Wycombe area, Penn Street, and I had no idea about schools. And so, funnily enough, the one that I found out about this faith school was from someone of a different religion. And I would say we have to be careful not to have caricatures of schools and caricatures that we're presenting in debates, because the picture that the rabbi just really wonderfully painted of I want my son to go, or my child to go to a school where they can sit next to a Christian, play football in the break with a Muslim, do homework with a Hindu, and walk back with an atheist, I can say completely describes the faith school that my daughter is going to. Now, I'm not building a case just on that one school, but I dare say I met someone in the hallway earlier that said, I went to a faith school all of my life. I'm an atheist. It made no change on my stance. I didn't feel pushed into beliefs whatsoever, and I had a wonderful education. So I would say, what should we consider when questioning state funding for schools? We should consider the type of education that they give. Complete education, body, mind, soul, and spirit, which is what Ofsted actually looks at when they come into schools. On inspection of schools, they look at how does the school develop their pupils spiritually, morally, socially, and culturally. I don't think that we need to do away with specific faith schools for Ofsted or any other governing agency to still be able to have a say in saying, will there be inclusion in different schools. I'd also say that it's a huge assumption that a non-specific state school, interestingly enough on this front, I went around these school gates this week and asked the different parents. Most of the parents which attend my daughter's school are not of any one faith background whatsoever. The majority would say that they're either agnostic or atheist. I went around and said, what is the opposite term for a faith school? And nobody could give me an answer, because you don't want to say normal schools, do you? Because that would mean that faith schools are not normal. You don't want to say things like, I'm giving you some of the examples people gave, a common school. That just sounds wrong. It sounds like a faith school is better than a different school. You don't want to say a non-faith school, because really I think that is the assumption that any single one school or any single one person actually holds a true non-faith-based worldview. Every single worldview, and that I would argue every single school, whether they're attached to a specific faith or not, will be shaping their teaching, will be shaping their curriculum, will be shaping their pupils according to the majority of the worldview of the teachers there. And I think that a non-specific faith worldview can be just as discriminatory, can be just as abusive in cases that we've heard recently, can be just as dangerous to our children's health. So really want to ask the question, what should the state be looking at? Should they just do away with faith schools, or should they be looking at how they are educated? And then what type of society, I think another question in this debate, actually truly motivates, and Neil, you brought this up wonderfully, what type of society truly motivates social inclusion and gives the real freedom of diversity in thought, in conscience, in worship, in everything? Is it this idea of what we're calling a secular society? What would that look like? I think once again, we're always in danger of polarizing two views. One, should we have a sacred society? Should we have sacred setups where you have to force one religion and exclude everybody? I'm not for that. I agree. Jesus was not for that. And I agree with Justin Welby in his talks about faith schools and some of the actual new research that has come out on behalf of the Church of England, because the Church of England does make up the majority of the faith schools in this country. They've said we need to be distinct and inclusive. That's what we're going for in our intake of pupils. So I don't think that we should have a secular society, and I don't think that we should have a sacred society. I think that all of us as thinkers, people here at the Battle of Ideas, should be arguing for and moving towards what I think, in the words of the Global Charter Conscience that was penned in 2012 and given in Brussels by someone called Dr. Oz Guinness, that we should be calling for the construction of a civil public square that maximizes freedom of thought, conscience, and religion for everyone. That is all people of all faiths and none. And I think that you can have that in a faith school, and you can have that in a non-specific faith school, just as equally, as long as it is monitored correctly. And then just maybe one final thought is, we are making a huge assumption as well that there are many, many members of society that do not hold religious views, that are not equal rights, that parents that pay taxes, parents that have a say in lots of other things in life, that they shouldn't be able to have a say as well. Well, I want my child to be educated in a way that takes into account some sort of religion. Is religion not part of the well-being of society? Shouldn't we introduce our children to people of Muslim faith, people of Sikh faith, people of lots of different faiths, and no faith, equally side by side? I don't think if you do away with specific faith schools, you will do away with discrimination. I don't think that you will do away with I don't think you'll do away with some of the hurdles that parents jump through to get themselves into particular schools. I also think that every single school, whether they are faith-based specifically or not, takes into account different requests of parents. I will make a case again locally to me in that there is another little primary school up the road that is non-specific faith-based, and you will not imagine the type of breakneck letter writing, buying things for the head of the teacher that happens, because it's a well-known school and they want their children to get into that primary school. It has nothing to do with faith. All schools, consciously or unconsciously, have certain things that they take into consideration, whether it has to do with the aptitude, whether it has to do with the sports background of the child, whether it has to do with the music ability, and it is what shapes the school. If we do away with faith-based inclusion as one of the variables, one of many variables, state approved, it will not do away with discrimination that happens on many different accounts in many different schools. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Richie.
It's great that your particular school is very inclusive, but I think if we look at the evidence overall, we'll find that religious schools are unfair, unpopular and unnecessary. And I'm going to set out some of that evidence looking at Church of England schools. I guess your school is a Church of England school based on what you said as well, and seeing that even Church of England schools, although they might be better than most, are not without problems. Really, I think what we're talking about here are three different areas where faith schools are different from other schools, namely admissions, employment and the curriculum. And I'm going to go through each of those in turn and look at what some of the evidence says. On admissions, we've already talked about the basic question: how can it be right for a young child, often at the age of 4, to be refused entrance to their local state school or the best school in their area simply because their parents are of a different religion or of no religion? At the most extreme, we see some Church of England and Catholic schools that are selecting parents on the basis of things like flower arranging or cleaning, the London Oratory example. I could think of a state-funded Jewish school that, as part of its admissions policy, requires families to dress modestly and have no TV or internet in the home. And I know of a state-funded Muslim school that gives extra points to parents who have completed the Hajj. But the evidence overall shows that such admissions policies do genuinely segregate children along socio-economic as well as religious and ethnic grounds. And this is because where there is religious selection, such policies are often burdensome to meet in a way that allows more motivated parents to gain their child a place by attending church when they otherwise wouldn't, for example, when the single mother working several jobs, or the recent immigrant who didn't know they had to be recording their church attendance for the last several years isn't able to do likewise. So if we look at the evidence of the impact of this, and in terms of how many pupils different types of school take that are eligible for free school meals, schools with no religious character typically take 11% more than that would be expected given their local areas. Church of England schools on average take 10% less. But what we see within Church of England schools as well is that there's a great variety in the degree to which their admissions policies choose to religiously select, which is unique. Other faith groups all have their admissions policies selecting as much as they can, but Church of England schools vary. And if we split off the Church of England schools whose admissions policies do not allow religious selection, then those are about 4% more inclusive than their area than you might expect. And you'll get diverse situations like Michelle's school. But if we take just the Church of England schools whose admissions policies allow 100% religious selection, then they're about 31%. They have about 31% fewer pupils eligible for free school meals than their local area. So you can see that there's a massive difference there that is caused by religious selection and how religious selection correlates with socioeconomic selection. And yet, overall, some 1.2 million school places are given priority on the basis of faith by state-funded schools where the schools are oversubscribed. That's some 17% of the total, and it's larger than the number of places at private, grammar or single-sex schools in this country combined. Compare it also to the fact that only about 4 to 5% of the parent-age population attends church every week. And you can imagine that there must be a massive spike in attendance amongst parents of 3-year-olds and then another massive spike when you get to the age of 10. I mean, that may sound far-fetched, but actually, if you think earlier this year, the Church of England commissioned some research into what makes their churches grow. And the researchers found that the thing that has the most direct impact on attendance is whether or not there is an oversubscribed church school nearby. They wrote that some churchgoing is clearly motivated by a desire to qualify for school admission and told churches being connected with an oversubscribed school was helpful, if not easy to engineer. So I think that we've got a real problem here when we have a system that incentivizes that kind of behavior. And not only do we have a real problem, we also have a very unusual system because the OECD did a survey not long ago into which countries allow their state schools to do that. And the only other countries they identify were Ireland, Israel, and Estonia. On the curriculum, the areas we're really talking about are things like religious education and sex and relationships education. In terms of religious education, while schools that are not faith schools have to teach about all the different principal religions, faith schools can teach essentially whatever they like. And at the moment, there's a giant battle going on over the review of the GCSE religious studies subject criteria, where the government has decided to change it to say that any schools doing that GCSE, whether faith schools or not, have to study at least 2 religions when they can currently study 1. And I think the fact that the Catholic Church, the Catholic Education Service, and all the Jewish organisations are objecting very strongly to that tells you a lot about how broad their curriculum is at the moment. And if we look at sex and relationships education, you often see, maybe not so much in Church of England schools, but again in other schools, that they might provide an abstinence-only education instead of providing full and comprehensive sex and relationships education when the evidence shows that that is what young people need. In terms of employment, finally, every single teacher at most faith schools can be legally religiously discriminated against in order to maintain the ethos of the school in terms of whether or not they're employed. Most faith schools can, require the maths teacher, the PE teacher, or even the science teacher to share the faith of the school. And I don't really think that that is right or logical. I think that it's depriving pupils in many cases of the best person for the job, and really the person who is hired should be based on how well they do in the interview and not on any preference given as a result of faith, given that these schools are fully state-funded in particular. I think what we should have instead is schools that are all fully equally inclusive of every young person and teacher, learning from with each other in much the way that Jonathan set out, and that doesn't privilege or discriminate in favour of anyone's particular beliefs in favour or against anybody else's. I think that there are a few arguments that you might see from the opposition on this front that we're not saying. So the first thing we're not saying is we're not saying there should be no religious education. I think it is very important to teach about different religious beliefs that different parts of society hold dear, and maybe we'll expand on that more afterwards. Secondly, I don't think there's any breach of human rights going on from a legal point of view. I think that that's quite clear, and I can again expand on that if I need to. And I think that we also need to focus on children's rights, where I think that there's a clear impetus to send children to mixed schools. And finally, in terms of things like the choice agenda, well, how's this for segregation? Most Muslim, Hindu and Sikh state-funded schools in this country have no white British pupils in them at all, compared to a third in the local area. Most Jewish schools have no Asian pupils in them, compared to 11% locally. Catholic schools often also take disproportionately few Asian pupils, whereas inclusive schools are much more mixed. By providing faith schools, you may have a diversity of types of school, but you don't have diversity within each school, and I think that is much more important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, finally, Kevin, your thoughts, please.
Can I just start off by saying that everything I say, Richie and Jonathan, it's delivered with love. I'm serious about that, guys, because I'm going to really pick a fight. You know, if there's a school of sociology called interactionism, and what interactionists tend to do is, when you're looking at the sociology of crime and deviance or mental ill health, etc., they want to not talk about the so-called mentally ill people or the so-called criminals and deviants. They want to talk about who's doing the labelling. And so what I'm quite interested in talking about quite a bit today is the critics of faith schools. So let me start. I believe in tolerance. That's why I defend faith schools. I believe in parental autonomy and rights. That's why I defend faith schools. If you believe in freedom, then my argument is that you must defend the right of a parent to send their child to whichever school they choose. It's called choice. You can disagree and dislike faith schools, but the campaign for the closure or the restriction is illiberal, intolerant, and authoritarian. I want to quote you a long sentence and take a guess if you can find out who said this, which imam or bishop or cardinal or whatever. Quote, "To force parents to send their children to a certain school against their will means to deprive them of rights which clearly belong to them in all free societies, the private right over their children and the social right to free association." Any guesses? It wasn't a religious person. It was that great liberal thinker and philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who said that in her definition of what constitutes a liberal society. She understood the importance of tolerance. My point is this, that it's not progressive or radical to campaign against religious schools or deny parents such a right. Today, liberalism has lost its direction. It's lost its way. The so-called liberal arguments against such schools, in my view, are based largely on ignorance and prejudice. There's nothing positive about the arguments that I hear, and I should have said I'm an atheist, incidentally, defending faith schools. Let me deal with some of the contemporary prejudices around this discussion. Religious schools poison young people's minds. They're centres of brainwashing. The young people are effectively simpletons, filled with all this nonsense. It's simply not true. Young people can think for themselves. They're critical, rational beings, able to process and evaluate and make judgments. Many reject the values and the ideas with which they're introduced to in religious schools. Another prejudice, Richard Dawkins is accusing parents, the big popular Richard Dawkins who lots of people love, he is accusing parents of child abuse. That's what he's doing. And he's able to do that, and lots of people don't think that that's a shocking state of affairs. And he, just pick out one of the quotes. page 317 of his God delusion. Raising a child to Catholic causes more psychological damage than child sex abuse. That's what I mean by ignorance and prejudice. Such comments, they're based on contempt and ignorance. And what I'm trying to challenge is that lots of people, especially young people who have a problem with faith schools, somehow think it's a progressive or radical position. Oh God, no, certainly not. That's why we need to have this argument and fight out today. And look, we'll come back to a lot of the evidence, but just to say almost everything Richie said was wrong. Faith schools don't cherry pick the academically more gifted people or middle class people. If you don't believe me, go and ask Ofsted. Look at the latest University of Bristol study, the ones before that from Durham, and the third one from the place I can't quite remember. Now, this is the point that's grudgingly accepted. I debated last week in Liverpool, 2 weeks ago, Stephen Law, the philosopher who opposes faith schools. He accepted that these weren't true, but they still get peddled as almost facts amongst the other side. Let me repeat this. If you take a Catholic school, Catholic schools take the most socially deprived students, on average much more than non-religious schools. It is a fact. It is a fact, if you don't believe me, speak to Ofsted, that the students that they take in, they do better with academically. And we're not talking about that they bring them in from a higher level. We're talking about if you look at what's called value added, contextually value added. These are facts. And Richie Said's got away with it for too long. I've been asking myself a question recently. Why is there such a fashion for this absolute hostile obsession with faith schools? What is it? Something's happened. Something's different. The bile that you hear about Muslim schools, I'm shocked. And Catholic schools and Jewish schools, there's something going on. I'm not quite sure what it is. Something I noticed from a couple of years back when Pope Benedict came to Britain, and lots of the so-called liberal publications. Now let me take a few guesses. I think it's because some people on the other side of this debate don't like parents and religions teaching strong values. I think the spirit of non-judgmentalism is such that they're incredibly hostile to that position. I think it's because there's been a moral panic whipped up. You see it with the whole Trojan horse discussion in Birmingham, which no doubt people from the floor will come in on and we can have a debate about. You see it in these wild, silly, exaggerated claims about all these schools not teaching theories of evolution and intelligent design, etc. And my point is that what I'm particularly interested in, which I haven't fully worked out, I think contemporary atheism and liberalism, which I think were progressive at the time of the Enlightenment and were open-minded and orientated towards new ideas, have turned in on themselves. And I think what we're witnessing is a really nasty, reactionary, exclusivist type of so-called liberalism, which I have got no time for. And as for the atheism, once upon a time, there was something progressive about atheism, not what I'm witnessing as the contemporary strand and narrative of that idea today. Stop scapegoating faith schools. If you don't like them, no problem. That's fine. But if you believe in tolerance, let them exist. For me, the problem in British education has nothing to do with faith schools. It's more about the crisis of what you might call liberal education. It's more about the failure of our non-religious schools, and in fact some religious schools who are not that religious anymore, to offer a positive account of what our society is and what it means to be a human being. We're no longer clear about where we are, about our value system. We're uncertain about that. We lack a web of meaning. Now, the really interesting point is that when you add all that together, non-religious schools are failing to spontaneously socialize the young generation. Now, I don't think religious schools are doing that fantastically well. If anything, my only problem with sort of Catholic schools is that they're not Catholic enough. I say let Jewish schools and Muslim schools be even stronger in their faith if they wish. That's what I call a tolerant society. The problem we have is the moral vacuum. I want to hear liberals and other critics of faith schools engage in that discussion, what some people refer to as the ethos question. Look, it's a fact. You know, all sorts of people are queuing up to put their kids into faith schools. Yeah, and you go, because they're academically better. Well, often they are, yeah. Why? Why? When they take often kids from the absolute position of non-faith schools. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the point, because the difference overall is not that big. But people are queuing up, they're voting with their feet. Now, I just want to finish with this point. There are several reasons why I think we need to defend faith schools. I've just got a wee note, so I'm going to skip the second last point. Toleration. If you believe in toleration, you need to defend them. Parental autonomy. If you believe in parental rights, you should not be afraid, number 3, of strong values, instead of the cynicism that we see from some of the people on the other side, although not all. If you want to talk about the problems in education, the problem is the crisis of liberal education. Let's not accept this caricature that we're presented of faith schools. And I realize I'm totally out of time, so I'm just going to stop mid-sentence. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, I just want to ask the panelists one question. Jonathan and Richie, you sort of proposed that a non-denominational form of education would be the alternative to faith schools, and it kind of suggests that the values of, if you like, the state, or those who are in charge of the state system, would be the ones that you would trust to transmit to, you know, school children. Are you being a little bit naive in thinking that necessarily the state values are good values? I can think of all sorts of nonsense that, you know, is emitted from state schools regarding like PSE or the therapeutic ideas and so forth. Isn't it a little bit dangerous to sort of demand that everyone conforms to what the political class would want children to believe in at a particular
Absolutely,
time?
which is why it's the wrong question to ask, because really no one's asking the state to educate our children religiously. There's a big difference between religious education, which is knowing about stuff, and religious confession or indoctrination, which is believing it. You know, we get the state to educate our children about Napoleon and Bismarck. They don't have to believe in them. I think the state should educate the children in Islam and Judaism and Christianity and Sikhism and Hinduism so that we know what makes up British society. We ought to have the knowledge. The belief, that comes from the home. And that's why, to be honest, I nearly felt like vomiting when Kevin was speaking, who said he was approaching with love, but then spewed out words like hostile, obsession, bile. If that's your love, well, then you can keep it, frankly. And I think you completely warped the idea, and you talked about free association. Free association means having a church and a mosque and a synagogue and a gurdwara in the high street, so that people can freely associate, send their children, have home ceremonies. It doesn't mean the state has to fund a particular belief system.
Okay, thank you. Richard, do you want to come back on?
Yes, I agree with all of that, and I think furthermore, there's no evidence that faith schools have a better ethos than other schools, or that their ethos has anything to do with any differences in academic attainment. In fact, the evidence is quite strong that any difference in academic attainment between faith schools and other schools is entirely due to their socioeconomic, their socioeconomic selection. Catholic schools may take more pupils than free school meals than a lot of other schools, but that's because they tend to be in the city, and if you compare them to their areas, then they take much fewer. And even the Christian think tank Theos concluded earlier this year in its report More Than an Educated Guess that the research seems to support the claim that students in faith schools generally do fare better academically than their counterparts in non-faith schools, but at the moment the body of evidence appears to suggest this is probably primarily the outcome of selection processes. Now, that report was summarised by the University of Bristol, so that's the University of Bristol. In terms of Durham University, earlier this year the Professor of Education and Public Policy there, Stephen Gorard, wrote an article in which he concluded that faith schools lead to unwanted and dangerous social and ethnic segregation between school intakes in what is meant to be a national school system. And given the lack of evidence that one type of school consistently performs better than any others, he concluded, a faith-based or faith dominance does not, in fact, make a school more successful, but may, in reality, be a cause for the needless damage of social segregation for no real gain. So it's ironic that you quoted two reports that seem to, I think, when I think the evidence from both houses shows the opposite.
Question for Kevin and Michelle. I mean, religious belief is often seen as a private matter. So it does beg the question, why should public institutions actually facilitate that more sort of private, that private belief system? Why should taxpayers have to pay for somebody else's private beliefs?
I think that goes back to what I was talking about earlier about should we have only privatized beliefs, or should we have a completely naked social square, a public square? I think to force people to only practice what they believe, only have their consciousness in their closed doors, is actually being, what Kevin said, illiberal. I think that the state should be able to fund the freedom of belief, whether it comes from a background of specific faith or whether it comes from a background of non-specific faith. Because I still will make the argument that if we take away faith schools, every other school will still be indoctrinating children with something, with a certain worldview. Take away a specific faith, and you're still going to be shaping the minds of students with a particular worldview, maybe an intensely secularist worldview that says that you shouldn't consider religion at all, that says that you shouldn't consider the well-being, the mental, physical, and spiritual beliefs of an individual. And so I think that we need to have and continue to argue for the state to fund things that provide a civil society, one where there is free thinking going on and non-discrimination.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, do you want to come up?
Well, it's really interesting because terms can mean all different things, but my idea of secularism, for example, is that I want to live in a society where if there's a demand for faith schools, people should have them. I think that's a good thing. People who are of faith also pay taxes, incidentally. And without going into the nitty-gritty, you'll also find that they pay a certain percentage, sometimes in some faiths as well, of the cost of their actual schools and so on and so forth. I mean, that's the first wee point. To me, to live in a society that would deny parents the right to send their children to a faith school when they pay taxes, I absolutely think is illiberal and not right. So that's the first wee point. But let me just, say something else, because it hasn't come up, just to almost, make a problem for myself, but I don't think it is a problem. I actually believe in discrimination. I believe in the idea that people of a particular religious persuasion have the right to freely associate and go to their place of worship and just to have a school which reflects their particular religious character and ethos and denomination. So I have no problem with those schools existing, and that means that you discriminate on the basis of who is allowed to go to those schools and so on and so forth. So, to me, that is my type of secularism and my type of tolerance. If you don't agree with it, no problem, but I want to just make the point that there's a very good argument to be made for that position. And I really don't want to get into all these nitty-gritty, they said that, we said that, but can I say one thing, Neil, and you can be the referee as to how much we go down this line? I just don't believe what Richie's saying, he's cheating. And I don't want the debate to get really personal. I know it's difficult, and I genuinely am sad that Jonathan wanted to vomit. I understand the things I said are a bit like hard line or whatever, but I genuinely want to have an honest conversation. It wasn't aimed at you personally in any shape or form. I'm just trying to get across the fact that that's how I genuinely would characterise some of the opposition to faith schools. But the point about segregation, it's really interesting. What Jonathan, I forget the name of your group. What are they called again?
The Accord Coalition.
So when you go onto the website and it says, evidence and all, it talks about all the evidence for segregation, you go on the link, and what there is a Lancashire, the Blackburn Telegraph, Lancashire Telegraph article where Ted Cantle is a couple of quotes from him. That's not evidence of segregation. And then when you go on down about how the faith schools don't take the most religiously deprived, Catholic schools were wrong about that, blah, blah, blah. Then you go to the link again, and all it goes is 10 arguments against faith schools, bang, bang, bang. And so on and so forth. And so this whole idea where they try to pin a lot of their arguments on evidence, I just think doesn't hang. Now, I'm happy to talk about evidence, but really what I'm trying to argue is that my position is based on my politics and my moral outlook.
And this is
Okay,
Professor
thank you.
Town.
Okay, no, I'll get the audience in. No, Jonathan, you can come back later on.
Okay, I just wanted to ask the anti-faith school side, what's wrong with discrimination precisely? There is just discrimination, there are unjust forms of discrimination. Unjust forms of discrimination include racism and sexism and homophobia. But the everyday discrimination we engage in as communities, when we form communities, is we choose to associate with one particular group of people. That doesn't stop us from, in other social settings, engaging in a social interaction with other people from other groups. So when I went to a Catholic faith school when I was younger, it didn't stop me from knowing people who are atheists. It didn't stop me knowing other kids who were from different backgrounds. And actually what it did give me is it allowed me to be in an atmosphere where I could have the formation within an atmosphere of being in a Catholic school of Catholic formation, of a worldview. That was quite helpful. It actually, I think, is helpful more broadly to have faith schools because it means you actually have people who are spiritually empathetic and spiritually literate in a way that actually we live in an incredibly religiously illiterate age. So I actually think that faith schools provide a good social service in that sense, but you haven't given us a moral case for why this supposed segregation, which is an interesting caricature of what really goes on, or why that form of just discrimination really oughtn't to exist when it exists in religious communities and indeed all forms of communities, in any case, all the time. So just from a point of view of sheer freedom of association, which is not enforced diversity out of it, it is not enforced diversity, freedom of association would dictate that, yes, we should have the ability to form whatever schools we like and live in a society where everyone is free to discriminate as they feel fit, when it's just.
I don't know what I think, which is why I'm here. But as a Catholic, my 2 kids go to our local community school, state community school, not to a faith school, and they won't ever go to a faith school. And I would suggest community school would be a good name for a non-faith school because it's got everyone from the community. Just a couple of points. I think it would probably sat here and listening, be more honest if, like our local Catholic school, was more honest and discriminatory and didn't pretend it was taking loads of people from the community and did just take people who are practicing Catholics. Because, to be honest, why would you want to go to a Catholic school if you're not a Catholic? I think it's crazy. But the issue that I have, having sent my children to a state comprehensive school, is that the quality of religious and spiritual teaching is pretty wishy-washy. And I think that the state system has got to pull up its socks in terms of teaching strongly comparative religion and spiritual religion and atheist beliefs, just like I do at home with my children and my atheist husband does do at home, and which is what I expect from my church when I take them to church. That's where the education is, not in a faith school.
I taught in a Catholic sixth form college, although most of my students were Hindu and Muslim. My daughters went to a Church of England school not far away, secondary school, and the opposite was the case, which sports Rich's point. So I accept there's wide diversity in faith schools. There's powerful arguments on both sides, and I think that if fairness was the only criteria, we would get rid of faith schools because they are arguably unfair to atheists and possibly to the working classes as well. If we only got rid of faith schools without getting rid of grammar schools and private schools, I think the middle classes would feel unjustly done by. It seems that parental choice is important, and this is one of the few areas where middle-class parents can still exercise their choice. Choice means you have a right to express a preference, doesn't necessarily give you a right to get your preference, and this would remove one remaining avenue. And the only avenue left to middle-class parents who are aspirational for their children would be to fork out tens or possibly in London even hundreds of thousands of pounds extra in order to move into the catchment area of a very good school, because these correlate with the affluence of the area they are found in. I think personally if we got rid of private schools and faith schools and grammar schools, the remaining ones, we would also incidentally abolish all the best schools, practically all the best schools that are left in this country. The counter-argument is, of course, it would probably raise the quality in the schools that were left. But on balance, I think that we should respect the wishes of parents. Parents make a very vital contribution, probably more than schools, to the success of their children. And I think we undermine their choices at our peril.
Yeah, go on now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to raise a couple of issues I had with what Richie had to say, which I thought were almost misleading. So he made the point that lots of faith schools seem to admit pupils on what seems to be quite unfair criteria. He gave the example of like flower arranging. But let's remember that faith schools, like every other type of school, is bound by the School Admissions Code. And that means that they have to look after children before anybody else. They have to accept pupils with special educational needs who are named on their EHC plan, just like everybody else. And if a school states its admissions policy that a parent has to go to church, then that policy is illegal. And the point then is that it's a faith school. The problem then is that it's operating illegal admissions practices. And let's also remember that faith criteria only kicks in when the school is oversubscribed. Not every school is oversubscribed. If you're undersubscribed, you have to take everyone. The second point I wanted to raise was to do with the curriculum. You seem to be concerned that faith schools are at liberty to teach whatever they want. But let's remember also that academies don't have to follow the national curriculum or free schools. So if you're concerned that faith schools have extra freedom, then surely we must be concerned about what's, quite frankly, a significant majority of the schools in operation at the minute. And I guess one other issue as well with faith schools is some people often worry about the curriculum in terms of like sex education is kind of an area that people worry they would get a particularly biased viewpoint. But parents can withdraw their children from sex education in every type of school. So I just think it's important to keep into perspective when we're critical about faith schools that let's not focus too much on specific aspects, and let's bear in mind that those issues can happen and occur in all types of schools.
My point is fairly brief, and Jonathan has touched on it slightly. For me, this is not about diversity, inclusion, tolerance. For me, this is about something that came up in the previous education debate, which Kevin was chairing, and so this contribution is directed really at Kevin, which is, what is education for? What are schools for? In my book, they are institutions for conveying the wealth of knowledge that humanity has accumulated over the last 2,000 years. Faith is not knowledge. Belief is not knowledge.
But what I'm going to do now is bring the panel in. Jonathan, would you like to come back on any points that you've heard so far?
Yes, I mean, the twofold objection to faith schools is one, the theory, as the last speaker actually, I think, put it very articulately, it's education, right? Which is what? Knowledge, it's options. It's not for beliefs. Beliefs are private. Beliefs are for the home. Beliefs are whether you take your child to the priest or the rabbi or the imam. So we do need to separate what education is about. But it's not just a matter of theory, it's also practice. Because unfortunately, I wish he was wrong, unfortunately Richie's right. And if you do look at the facts, and you can go to the government, you don't have to trust the Accord website, even though it actually is accurate. You can go to the Houses of Parliament archives or whatever, and you can see that faith schools do take less people who are on special education needs, less people on free school meals. In other words, they are not catering for the poor and vulnerable in society. And if I thought that's actually what the Christian ethos was about, the poor and the vulnerable. So if they're not even doing it in their faith schools, then that's not very clever, and perhaps more importantly, they are actually a force for socio-economic segregation in society. And you see, it also comes back to this larger question of, what sort, let's go away from our own individual schools. What sort of society do we want to have in 10, 20 years' time? Do we want it to a society where children grow up in harmony with each other, or a ghettoized society? And unfortunately, having children in separate blocks, and that's what we're doing, we're actually separating them with blocks of concrete from each other. And it's precisely because we're a multi-faith society, which is great, we've got to work very hard when not making it a multi-fracture society. And I think we need to keep an eye on the long-term goal rather than some short-time, for and against my faith or your faith. And I think faith leaders have actually got to be a little bit unselfish and say, yes, I believe in my faith, yes, I want to pass it on, but I'm not going to ask the state to do it, I'm not going to ask the taxpayer to do it, I'm going to do it through the church, through the home, and the power of belief, but not make it a state institution.
Kevin.
Yeah, freaking good question from Jenny. I happen to know her, who was at the last debate about what are schools for. But can I just say, in response to the first bit of what you said, when she was, it's not about liberalism, it's not about intolerance, it's not about prejudice. It is, and that's central to my argument. So central to my argument is that the so-called radicals and progressive on the other side of the fence are full of prejudice and ignorance, and they set up caricatures of what faith schools are. And that's partly the basis with which I want to address the debate today, to attack that. Look, what are schools for? God, this is a really, really, really good question. And, okay, so I think a school should be a place where you transmit a body of knowledge. I think that that's a central core element of a school, right? But two things. Number one, if people of faith want to set up faith schools, then I respect their choice and the right to do that. But also, you see, what also comes into the equation is schools are microcosms of broader society in different ways. And what you have is a cultural aspect to the question. And so if a faith group want to set up a faith school because they think inherent in the education that they want to teach their kids are certain values, then I think that that's fine. Now, the really tricky thing, and this is extremely tricky, I think, and I'm being honest, I'm not saying I'm on absolutely firm ground. The tricky thing is that in the process of teaching a body of knowledge, I think that a byproduct of that is that values emerge, space for debate and discussion emerge, and the possibility of transcendence and so on and so forth, as certain faith schools see it. So I think there's an absolute rationale in which you can defend faith schools on that basis. The difficulty, I think, is that we live in an interesting time where some people almost want to bypass the knowledge element to get straight to the values. But finally, can I just say, on the knowledge bit, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's a fact. The faith schools teach the knowledge better. Go and ask Ofsted. So this idea that's dripping in, that somehow the faith schools don't look after the knowledge bit, is just not true.
Richie, is there anything that you want to respond to?
I'll kind of make 2 points. Firstly, about why I don't think it's at all liberal to oppose faith schools, and secondly, about how many parents want them anyway. Kevin started his talk with a quote from Hannah Arendt, where she defended freedom of parental choice. If a parent wants to send their children to a certain type of school, then they should have the right to do so. Now, what he didn't do was he didn't give the context in which she said that quote. She said that quote in defending those protesting against the forced integration of the Little Rock schools in America in the 1960s. So I think, and I think we would all in this room agree that that was a good thing, that those were forced to integrate. And I'm not saying that faith schools are as harmful as the racially segregated schools were in America. But I hope that this goes towards the point that we should get away from the notion that if some parents want something, then we should provide it. And instead, we should collectively assess any particular proposals on the table for the spending of taxpayer funds, and together come to a decision based on civic and democratic conversations as to whether or not we should fund and provide any particular type of school. Now, I don't think we should fund faith schools because I think that they are harmful in terms of segregation, the quality of the education they provide in certain areas. Yes, academies have freedoms too, but they don't have freedom to teach RE from a faith-based point of view, for example. They tend to be more problematic, faith schools tend to be more problematic in what they teach in SRE and so on. So I think that's why there are problems there, and I think that is the argument against faith schools. And in terms of how many parents actually want them, as a follow-on point, some individual faith schools are extremely popular, of course, but if you look at surveys where parents have been asked what factors they consider to be important when when picking which schools to send their children to, only 5% actually say that faith is one of their top 3 most important factors. The factors that are overwhelmingly important are whether or not schools are good schools. And faith schools, as we've already heard, often might happen to be good schools because of the fact that they're socioeconomically selecting, and the evidence overall shows, and we talked about that earlier, that there is no difference in academic performance between the schools when you can control for the social backgrounds of the different pupils they take in. So in fact, faith and ethos are red herrings here in terms of the engines of parental choice and which schools end up being individually more popular.
Thank you. Michelle.
Thanks. I would like to start kind of on that question of why would you want to go to a faith school that you brought up, and maybe pick up where Richie just left off. It's been shown that 72% of the population agree that now this is specifically Church of England schools, but they do make up the majority of faith schools, that Church of England schools help young people to grow into responsible members of society. And so I would argue that on the educational basis, that's why parents choose to send their kids to faith school, even if they aren't from a Catholic, a Sikh, a Muslim, or a Christian background. That actually, what is education? I think that was a great question that you came up with. The education, I believe, is passing on the wealth of knowledge, but it can't just stop there. And I think people voting with their feet, like Kevin talked about, the way we pass on education, the way it's conveyed, is why faith schools, not just because of a socioeconomic background and where these schools are placed and because it brings in richer or more beneficial students or more beneficial characters, that's why people pick these faith schools, because it not only passes on a body of knowledge, but often in specific faith-based schools, it then teaches you how to critique that knowledge. It then teaches you how to sensitively and civilly, as I'm talking about, not just in a sacred way and not just in a secular way, civilly pass on that knowledge to other people from other faiths, to engage with your body of knowledge in a different way in diverse settings. And then it teaches students how to decide if that body of knowledge is true. Because at the end of the day, education is not just about knowledge. To divide knowledge and beliefs is a false dichotomy. We all believe something. It's getting to the end of what type of belief is true. Just because you've been passed on a belief, just because you've been passed on knowledge, doesn't mean you shouldn't learn how to critique it. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't have to learn to wrestle with, is this knowledge actually true? And true in many different ways. True in how I live it out, true in the way I relate to other people, true in the way I make decisions, true in the way I reject it or not. And I believe that faith schools handle the way that we pass on the knowledge, not just the dumping of knowledge, in a way that makes many people say, I want to vote with my feet, even if I'm not of a specific faith background. And I would want to just second what she said about the admissions policy over there, as I don't think that we should be discriminating in an illegal way against which students should come, but I do think to stop faith schools or any schools from taking into consideration different variables, not just faith, different variables, as all schools do in their admissions policy if you read them after all of the legal thing, after all of the legal students that they have to take in. I think that is doing something that we actually can't call for it. We could call for it, we could write it out, we could take away faith schools, but then many other faith schools would still have various things that they were considering, not discriminating, but considering when taking pupils in when they're oversubscribed.
Let's take it out to the audience again.
In my own mind, I suppose I find it quite helpful to make a distinction between education and socialisation, or at least have both concepts at work when we're thinking about what's going on in the education system with reference to the points that were made here. And I think in terms of the project of education, strictly speaking, and its connection to subject knowledge, the university is the most pure, should be the purest expression of that enterprise. Unfortunately, it isn't. That's another discussion. It isn't. I think, though, and universities necessarily do other things too. Even if they were much better and different to how they are now, they would do other things. I think schools need to do a completely different thing than what they're doing at the moment in relation to education. But I think schooling is about more than education, and schools will be about more than education and should be, because schools also socialise children. They're a place where we socialise our children. And I think that's a way of thinking about this discussion that you've been having, to see those both as being things that go on in the school. And I think when it comes to the socialisation, that's to say the way in which we try and bring the next generation into our world, I have absolutely no problem at all with saying that where parents want that socialisation process to reflect their deeply held belief, that is entirely appropriate. And to argue against it is to argue against the appropriateness of parents seeking to influence children in relation to the socialisation of the child. I mean, it's the most absolute expression of the undermining of parental autonomy that you could have, to argue that parents shouldn't be able to send their children to a faith school. I think it is a pure expression of a utter disregard for parental rights and parental autonomy. And one of the things that I find most interesting about all of this at the moment, which is reflected in this panel, is Where are the advocates of faith? I mean, we've got an atheist, and you're very nice, but a pretty wishy-washy advocate of faith schools, making all sorts of points about evidence and this and that and the other. I mean, where is somebody who believes making this case? Yeah, over there, exactly. And to me, this is one of the very interesting things about all of this discussion, is that in a way, I think that the other side of what's going on at the moment is really about a crisis of belief and a crisis of the church. I mean, that's why the C of E is packing its, pews with middle-class parents who no more believe in God than I do, because they want to get their kid into the local C of E school because they want to advantage their child. It's because the church is unable to get people to believe. It's the crisis of belief. And you can't then, pin the blame on parents for all of that, and to say that those who do believe have no right to express their faith and their belief. They do. And the parents that I feel sorry for at these schools, I mean, the one near us, right? My kids go to the community school, and, the therapeutic inability of them to communicate anything worthwhile is profound, although I'm sure this is the case in C of E schools as well. But the people that I feel sorry for are our local C of E school that basically has white middle-class kids and black Africans. The school my kids go to, it's the Muslims and the middle-class atheists who can't be bothered to go to church. Sorry. The people I feel sorry for are the black Africans who actually believe in God. And they would actually like the children at their school taught about God, And I think that people in churches need to stand up for themselves a bit more, frankly.
Okay, thank you. Excellent points.
Can I just say, just because people aren't religious anymore doesn't necessarily mean there's a crisis in belief. It just means they believe other things. The issue of choice, I think, is quite a powerful one, parental choice. After all, I don't believe in acupuncture, but I do believe that a tax-paying individual has a right to choose acupuncture as a form of treatment if they want. After all, it is their money and their choice. But I think it's limited, the extent to which we can make the issue of choice pertinent. After all, we're talking about children, aren't we? And if we go as far as we can on the issue of choice, then it leads us into the question of where that ends. I mean, for example, what if parents of Scientology beliefs or Heaven's Gate cultists wanted to exercise their choice? What would we do with that? So I think we need to think very carefully about how much parental choice informs the decisions we make.
To Kevin, I think you're talking about parental authority, and you said that children still have the capability of choosing if they're going to listen to what a faith school teaches them. I'm wondering if you've heard the phrase, "Give me a child at 7 and his mind will be mine for life." Children, it's very easy that children will be indoctrinated, and I think we should talk about freedom from religion, and I think that a child's right not to be subjected to certain religious beliefs is more important than the parent's right to subject him to those religious beliefs. And I was wondering what you'd say about that.
Okay.
Jonathan and Richie, you don't seem to know what you stand for, because you're arguing that faith schools should be banned because they're not inclusive of everyone and they're just terrible places. But then you're saying, oh, but faith schools are bad because they're not inclusive of everyone and they're terrible places, but people should be allowed to go into faith schools. So are you arguing that they're good places that are so good that they should allow everyone from everywhere in, or are you arguing that they're bad? And it's a really paradoxical argument that you're giving, so you don't seem to know where you stand. Secondly, Jonathan, your idea of you should keep your faith in the home and that faith should be a private thing, shouldn't it be more of a way of life than just a private thing? For example, a Muslim who wears a hijab, do they put it on at home but only take it off when they go outside because faith is a private thing and should be kept in the home?
It would appear that faith schools are caught up in a crossfire, the marketisation of education, and the fact that we have at the moment the situation whereby parents are encouraged to exercise some kind of choice. And this has caused a huge problem, and certainly the people in the Church of England, as far as I understand it, are actually very uncomfortable about the fact that lots of people are selecting their schools, because 25 years ago when choice was brought in to the school system, and people began to look at league tables, which were then published, they began to notice that some schools had better results than others, and invariably the schools which had better results were religious schools. And the reason for that, as keeps being pointed out, is because socioeconomic background makes a big difference in terms of what schools can do and so on. I spoke earlier, and I'm still surprised to hear, it always amazes me when I hear people talking about good schools and excellent schools and the best schools. These concepts are, if by that you mean that the schools with the best results, that's what you mean. They're not the best schools. Good schools are the ones which get good results, according to Ofsted. Same thing with outstanding best. The whole idea that this is a better school is not true. And if you look closely at any set of schools in any of the cities in the UK, you'll see that the schools with the very good results, so they're getting good numbers, they're often selective schools one way or another. So I think that, again, the Church of England doesn't particularly like this generally, and they're getting most of the schools. The other thing I would say is as well, Richie, I don't entirely agree with you. I'm a primary school teacher, and I've taught in Church of England schools, and I've taught in community schools, and we don't, neither of those schools teach children or indoctrinate them or have much belief in them. Church of England schools are like the rest of the Church of England. They kind of light touch about everything, really. School teachers are required to teach about religion and encourage children to learn from religion, but there's no indoctrination. That's my experience. You'll get people in Church of England schools who will be a little bit more open about their beliefs. But again, in the Church of England, it's a light touch thing. So again, I think this is a bit of a slight thing. I think the issue here is you're caught in the crossfire of something. People who are running religious schools, people who are running religious schools don't really want to be in the position which they're in. I'm not sure what the solution is.
Very stimulating discussion, but I actually have felt that you're all four of you, you've got strong points individually, but I don't feel you're debating each other's points. I feel that I'm hearing separate strands of arguments through this. And I think the debate, to me, has become quite muddled around a central issue, which is a distinction, and as someone who's been in education my whole life, it's something I've hammered home to my students, between causality and correlation. A lot of what's been discussed today have been correlations between faith schools and positive academic results and positive social results, inclusion versus exclusion, et cetera, on both sides. So we've got statistics that have been argued both ways, et cetera. That doesn't speak to the bottom issue about whether it is the faith aspect of a faith school which is making that distinction, and is the having a faith-based school a good thing or a bad thing, more good or more bad, in the best interest of a child being prepared to live in a multicultural society. To me, that's the kernel of the debate, and I feel the debate's been very cluttered by all these other things, whereas actually, it may well be true that faith schools have better performance. That speaks to that fact. That doesn't tell us whether the better performance is due to the fact that it's a faith school or not. It doesn't help us progress towards whether we should or shouldn't embrace faith-based schools, whether they're inclusive or they're not more or less inclusive. Again, the question ultimately needs to go back to the debate, which is whether the kernel of the debate was, should the state be financially supporting a school which is quote-unquote faith-based? Now, if the school has all the qualities of a non-faith-based school, then I would echo what people in the audience have said, well, what's the point of it? There's got to be something about it that's specific to being faith-based. And that's what this debate should be revolving around, to my mind.
I'm very sorry if I've come across as wishy-washy in my beliefs, and let me speak directly to that and then what you've just said finally. I would say, as a Christian that believes that Jesus Christ was real, you can debate me afterwards, that he lived an amazing life, that the values that he espoused, the inclusion that he brought to people, and the way of life that he lived is outstanding across history. I personally, as a parent, and personally as a believer, think that part of the reason, actually the main reason why these faith-based schools are doing consistently better is because they're built on an ethos of these Christ-centered values. choose. That's not always the case, though. That's why I didn't make that as that's a broad sweeping statement that every single school that says they're either non-faith-based or faith-based sticks to it. That just doesn't happen. In theory, it sounds good. Practically, we know that doesn't happen. However, even stating that, I still believe, and this is what Justin Welby, I think, was getting at, was saying we should intake many more students that are not just Church of England. If I believe that those morals are so good and that the schools that teach those set people up for educational success, then I believe we should be taking in people from outside of the faith. However, it's chicken and egg, and I'm wrapping up, because if we don't have the students and the families that firmly believe that as part of it and able to say, I want to choose to bring my child up in that way, it's going to dilute the whole basis for why that faith-based school has an advantage. So I hope I've come across less wishy-washy and given you some cause for that.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, can you be very
on the
succinct as well?
question of faith in the home, I'm not suggesting for a second to be limited to the home, but more that the direction comes from the home. Having been a little bit unkind to Kevin, let me love bomb him now. And say you're right that this is all wrapped up with two other crises, the crises of school education system in general, which is why a lot of parents are opting for faith schools, not because they actually want the faith, but because they actually want the black-white separation. Nasty thing to say, but absolutely right. And also because they want the academic tables. A lot of people are using faith schools as grammar schools by the back door, and that's the harsh reality. It's also a crisis in the church. We know the church is emptying. I'm not point scoring, certainly always answer great either, but the churches are emptying. The one thing they have left is the church schools, and that's why they're so desperate to hang on. So it's a Christian crisis as well. And finally, let me just say, you heard some nice things about faith schools and some fluffy things, but let's look at the hard reality. If I had suggested that you rearrange yourself, and that Jews over there, Christians there, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus there, atheists at the back and agnostics down here, how horrified would you have been? How offended would you have been? Would you have felt it was divisive? Would you have felt it was helpful that you were segregated into your little close associations? No. You would have said that's horrible, and that's what we're doing to our children, and what we're creating is an educational apartheid system.
Okay, Kevin.
First of all, on the woman who made the causality correlation point, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So if the faith schools aren't doing a better job academically, it doesn't matter. I wouldn't get wrapped up on the point that you're making. My point is that I'm prepared to defend the faith schools even if their exam results are crap. My argument is done on the basis of toleration and freedom and choice and parental autonomy. That's my point.
Yours, not yours. Shh. Excuse me, please do not. Just shout. Don't.
I'm
come back
happy to
after
come back
that.
if you want. No problem. I'm happy to engage you. So that's that wee point. Now that guy just threw me. What was the second thing I was going to say? Yeah, it was the lad over here, yourself, I think, was saying about that was the Jesuits named that. That was the famous phrase from the Jesuits. Give me somebody at 7. If only Catholic schools were friggin' Catholic. I mean, if only, of course, parents play a role in the bringing up of their children and stuff. If I've got time, I'll tell you about my 15-year-old goes to Finchley Catholic, comes back laughing and absolutely full of ridicule. And so on and so forth. And I think it's partly because his RS teachers and so on don't actually have that much confidence and belief in what they're arguing to him or what they're trying to say. But I also think he's old enough and to reject and weigh things up for himself. Can I just say, though, the best time of my life in education, really run down working class West Belfast, height of the Troubles, I was taught by Irish Christian brothers, was when we were discussing the morality of IRA violence and the legitimacy. I support the IRA as a young boy in school. I thought we were entitled to fight the British with armed struggle. And the Christian Brother Harney, was saying no. And we opened it up, and every week, the whole class, we'd have the most brilliant discussions about the morality of armed struggle. And we'd go to Latin America and look at Nicaragua and El Salvador and liberation theology. They were brilliant. It absolutely nails this myth that somehow in religious schools you don't have a potential for critical debate and discussion. By the way, it's a good thing that schools indoctrinate. I'm just smiling that no one thinks non-religious schools don't indoctrinate. I mean, that's a really interesting one. And final sentence, sometimes you get jealous of people when they say things better than you. And that the Ellie Lee at the back, on her point about socialisation, absolutely nailed it, and how parents have got the right to socialise their children as they see fit.
Okay, Richie.
Yeah, it's interesting that what Kevin just said about academic results, because I think he was the one that brought up how faith schools supposedly have better academic results in the first place. I tried to put...
Rich.
No, I didn't. Well, I put the point back across in response that the evidence quite clearly shows that any difference in results is due to the difference of intake. At the start, I made the 3 points, that the 3 things where faith schools are actually different from other schools is in their admissions policies, their employment policies, and the curriculum. And then I talked about those 3, and I think those are the 3 things that we should keep in mind throughout this debate, because those are the 3 things where they are in practice. And secondly, if I can make one other point on terms of parental rights, nobody is arguing against parental rights to bring up children in line with their own faith. If you take away faith schools, then parents will, of course, continue to do that, either through sending them to private faith schools or, more likely, through educating them, for example, at church in their own time. But I think that schools, it's really important, are inclusive environments that do not privilege any one particular religion or non-religious belief over any other, but treat them all equally, and they're integrated and allow that different people to commune with each other, no matter what their backgrounds are.
I think the guy who spoke from a Church of England school was a bit defensive, because you were saying at your school, where there was Church of England teaching, it was very wishy-washy. And it was almost a bit like, well, it doesn't really matter, because most of these schools aren't religious. Well, I actually work at a faith school, a Jewish faith school. And actually, they do take the religious education very seriously. My question is, I mean, in the sense that all students get extended religious education, largely orientated around Jewish beliefs, Jewish ways of looking at the world and what have you, much of which is discussion-based as it happens, rather than intensive indoctrination, but it's extensive, and some parents who are in that environment also opt for quite intensive additional religious text education. My question is, where would you want them to go if they can't have that within the state context? Because some of them would simply, if you're concerned about segregation, some of them would clearly take it elsewhere. And then for the rest of them, you're basically saying, well, they can't have, they'd have to provide it just for themselves. Well, parents can't always provide that level of education, that depth of education. So where would they go?
As a black Christian young lady, I went to a school which wasn't religious, and I can definitely tell you there is massive indoctrination in non-religious schools. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous, and I think they should get rid of PSE and religious studies in non-religious schools, because I've never seen, it's useless. In all my secondary school year education, they taught me nothing about sex, nothing. And I would have learned more if I'd gone to a Christian church. I think parents reserve the right to say, I don't want my child to go to a school which is non-religious. They should have religion in the curriculum. And I think this idea that of indoctrination, that they're toxic, they're not toxic. What's more toxic is the things they teach us in normal schools about the segregation is created in non-religious schools. They teach us that we bully each other. They tell us how we should feel about each other, that we're stunted, and they teach us to be passive about so many things which we are not taught in religious schools.
Okay, thank you. Ken?
I think I personally believe that parents have much more of an impact on what their child believes than a faith school will. So I think even if you send your child to a faith school, if your parents are very liberal and very tolerant, you won't have any prejudices against other people, whereas you could be sent to a non-specific faith school and still be very prejudiced and intolerant. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
There is an irony here, a supreme irony. We know that the primary variable for the selection of faith of a person as they grow up is the faith of their parents. People generally adopt the faith of their parents. Michelle, you're a famous Christian apologist, and you've sent your daughter to a faith school. Now, it's ironic that this militation for faith schools has been conducted primarily under the rubric of choice. Now, how much of a choice does your daughter have, being that you're a famous Christian apologist, and then you've sent her to a Christian school? You might say you're a champion of many things, but the champion of your child's choice to choose her own worldview, you are not.
I think the view from the right side of the table that faith schools should be publicly funded to create a healthy and open public square is quite disturbing. One of the core principles in the founding of the United States is the separation of church and state, which is in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And the founding fathers recognized that that was critical to a healthy democracy. And I think when you get into government funding of religions, it gets into a really dark area.
Well, I'd like to say that the argument against faith schools is premised on the fact or the feeling that contemporary modern liberal views are the correct way of thinking, the way that we should all think and we should all believe. And this idea is, I guess, filtered through the education system. However, one of the key ideas behind liberalism, or one of the ideas that liberalism supports, is tolerance. And tolerance is the belief that we can have different beliefs and we can disagree with each other, and then we can also criticize and challenge each other. And I do think that the state funding religious schools is not about the state promoting segregation or discrimination or religion. It's about the state promoting tolerance and liberal views, the idea that we can all believe different things. And if we do believe them inherently in and within ourselves, that's something that we will put past to our children because we think that is right. And it doesn't mean that the general view is any more right than we are.
I think there's been quite a few generalisations about faith schools. They're an incredibly diverse sector of the education system, and I think there's a bit of ignoring a bit of an elephant in the room. The reason that we're having this panel discussion, the reason that this is controversial, is because there have been a series of controversies, particularly about Muslim schools and about British Muslim kids in mainstream schools and how that is affecting the education there. I think it's a pity that we didn't have a Muslim panellist or a panellist that is able to speak on those issues. But I would add to the other gentleman that said that this issue is in the crossfire of the issue of general failure of schools. The bigger crossfire, I think, is the issue of what are the limits of British tolerance, what are British values, what is British identity, because that is that's the context in which a lot of these moral panics about faith schools, in particular, sort of Muslim schools, and the Muslim issue keeps coming up a lot. And I think the only person that kind of alluded to it was probably Kevin. With you mentioned moral panics and to do with the moral vacuum and the fact that schools are not demonstrating a positive image of society. And as a researcher in the anthropology of education, recent research shows that supplementary schools have just there's been an explosion of them all over the UK, particularly in London. There's black supplementary schools, Muslim supplementary schools, supplementary schools from all sorts of faith and ethnic groups, because parents feel they need an alternative for their children that mainstream schools aren't providing.
Final thoughts, Richie?
So the lady at the back who talks about schools promoting contemporary modern liberal values as being the alternative to faith schools, well, let's look at same-sex marriage, for example. I think that's quite informative. What I think a good inclusive school should do is it should say, here's what the law of the land says, here's what the Church of England hierarchy's view is, here's what the Catholic hierarchy's view is, here's what the Muslim and the Jewish hierarchy's views are, here's what the population's views are, and present all these different options. And I think it's very informative if we look at what the Catholic Education Service actually did. In 2012, it wrote to every Catholic secondary school in the country and told them to all promote a petition against same-sex marriage. And I think that is a very one-sided point of view for a school to take. It possibly broke equality laws and also laws against political indoctrination. And I think that what we should have is we shouldn't have schools that set down one particular view on matters of religion or belief, but that are inclusive of all views and allow young people to form their own opinions, strongly or weakly held as those young people like.
Kevin?
If you think that you can stand in a non-religious school and criticise homosexuality and so on, you're absolutely mistaken. You haven't been in school recently. My God. And, young people should absolutely have the right to criticise homosexuality and same-sex marriage, but the problem is they're not allowed to. Absolutely not allowed to in non-religious schools. And by the way, Catholics are absolutely entitled in any religious group to criticise not just same-sex marriage, but homosexuality if they wish. That's the type of society I want to live in. It's called toleration. And on the young lad at the back, who's Peter, is a student of mine, he was criticising me. He's the last lad to speak. Fair play to you, Peter, on the US Constitution point. Don't have heaps of time to explain it, but the really interesting debate you open up there is what do we mean by secularism? I have a view of secularism which would be different from the US Constitution or French Constitution, where we have the space for people to be allowed to send their people to state-funded private schools. I wanted to say one last thing, and I can't find where I put it, so can I just instead come back to say, finally, my last sentence? Look, this has been a heated debate. I accept that, and everything I've said, I've tried to say it with honest, genuine positivity, and I didn't mean any malice to any individuals. But I just want to say to people in the audience who may be still, undecided on this question, that at the end of the day, even if there's certain things that you don't like about faith schools and so on and so forth, on the basis of tolerance and on the basis of parental choice and rights, I think you should defend faith schools and the right of parents to socialise their children as they see fit.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, final thoughts?
Yes, actually, on Kevin's point about, there are genuine arguments for and against, obviously. I was really saddened the other day. I went to a school in Finchley in North London, which many of you will know is a very Jewish area, heavy Jewish density. I went there because it received an award for its inclusivity and its openness and tolerance. It was a community school. And I went there and I found the head told me that they had Christians, all sorts of variety of Christians, and Buddhists and Baha'is and Zoroastrians and Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims, every single one, and that's why they got this award. The one thing they didn't have was any Jews, even though they were living in Finchley. Why? Because all the Jewish kids were out of the community school. They were all in various Jewish day schools. And that meant that all these Christian, Muslim, Hindu, etc. kids saw Jews around them in the streets, but never actually met them, never sat next to them, never interacted with them. And the same would apply for Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu schools and Catholic schools. And I actually worried about the sort of society we want to create. And actually, I want a society where children grow up at ease together and emerge together and form a harmonious society together.
Okay, thank you. Michelle.
I just want to pick up on the question about the choice of my daughter, because we've had a lot about parental choice here. This term that you threw out, I've gone from a wishy-washy pretty girl to a famous apologist. Apologetics, if you go back to the Greek word, means to make a case, a persuasive case. And whether or not you intend to do that, all schools, all parents, all families, all friendships are making a case for a certain worldview at one point every single day. Some are very strong cases, some are very weak cases. And I would say that as a Christian, I am going to be making a strong case, not just to my daughter, but to hopefully everyone I come in contact with, that I believe that my worldview and the way I interpret the world is true and is persuasive. I'd like to talk to you about that. That's not the same thing as forcing someone to believe the same way as I do, as forcing them to worship the same way that I do, as forcing my daughter to do that. It's already been stated that parents can pull their child out of religious education classes if they want to, so they're not forced. They can pull them out of sexual education classes so that they're not forced. And so I think that we need to give chance for all of our children, all of our friends, all our families to be exposed to lots of different worldviews. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't say, but this is the one that I believe is the best, and then let them decide for themselves. If my daughter decides not to believe the way that I do, she's still my daughter. I will always love her. And I want to give her the choice to think for herself.
Okay, thank you. All right, we've run out of time. We've run over time as well, but I'm sure you'll agree it's been a hugely interesting, stimulating debate, and we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.